Black Widow, directed by Cate, is the first ever full-length superhero movie that is dedicated specifically to the character of Black Widow. Scarlett Johansson returns as Natasha Romanoff, and it is the story of her on the run after the events of Captain America's Civil War, and this tells the story of her reuniting with her family to then take down the Red Room, which is the place that made her into the spy that she is today. I'm going to be honest, this movie didn't do much for me. I was talking about it with one of my friends long before this movie came out, and one of the things that was universally said between the two of us was this movie, the worst thing it could be is average, filler, and it doesn't progress the timeline of the MCU. And unfortunately, that's what this movie is. If you look at all of the MCU, you have your highs and then you have your lows, and it's just kind of like you balance yourself out at some point. And there are a few movies in the MCU that I do kind of find like smack dab in the middle. Like if you want to introduce somebody into what Marvel is, that's kind of what you want to show them, just because it gives you a minimum of like there's this good stuff and then there's this bad stuff, but it's all encompassing and it's all enjoyable. This is probably along those lines. It's a very average movie come Marvel standards, and it's unfortunate because I think this movie would have actually been a lot better had this movie come out long before Avengers Endgame, because spoilers, Black Widow is dead in the current timeline, and they have to make a prequel of this movie in order to make a solo Black Widow movie. And people have been clamoring for a Black Widow movie for a very long time, so it's hard to, like, grab onto the story. It's hard to, like, get invested when you know the outcome of it, for the most part, is that she'll be fine in the end because she's got to make it for Infinity War and Endgame. The family aspect of the movie is very good in my opinion. I thought Florence Pugh as her sister does a phenomenal job. She really stole the entire movie for me. I thought she was very funny. I thought she acted really well. She acted like a normal person in my opinion, because sometimes some of these Marvel movies tend to kind of have a little, obscurity here and there. But this definitely, like, it lends itself to be, like, she's, like, part of the audience almost at times. Like, there's a great conversation that she has with Natasha about why she does superhero poses every time she lands out of a helicopter or something, as if people are watching her, which is 100% true. And she really is the best part about this movie for me personally. As I mentioned, the story is kind of convoluted and it's, not very interesting. But also, the other thing that you would expect from a Marvel movie is its action scenes to be good, and they're just fine to, like, okay. Nothing really stands out as far as any action set pieces go. A lot of it is kind of like bare minimum stuff. Like, you might find yourself thinking you're enjoying something a lot, and then it kind of just falls apart at one point, and then you kind of don't get as much enjoyment out of it as you think you should. The best one in this movie, in my opinion, is the car chase scene along with Taskmaster, because the comedy string through it does help it a lot more than, like, later on in the movie or towards the beginning of the movie. Some of the action pieces aren't really great, throughout, but that one is kind of like the standout one, but it's not, like, anything comparable to some of the other stuff that they have done in the past. And speaking of which, with Taskmaster, you would think that Taskmaster was going to be a way bigger antagonist in the movie, and unfortunately, he's not. Taskmaster is very much there for a side villain, because there is a larger villain at hand, except you don't see him for the majority of the movie. And that does not help a screenplay whatsoever. If you don't have a villainous presence on the screen, the events that are taking place have no stakes. And for them to have taken basically one villain and just kind of shove them off to the side for a while, to be like, no, he's like hiding and they have to find him. But then your secondary villain also doesn't do much, then you've lost the audience in a sense. You lose any sorts of intensity that you may have throughout the entire movie. So in the end, Black Widow is a very middle of the ground movie that very much should have taken place way before her character had come to an end in Endgame. I believe that this movie would have been perceived a lot better if They would have done this back in 2014. They would have done this right after Civil War. They should have done this after Civil War. If this is the direction that they were going to be going, it's just it's hard for me to understand why they've even done this movie if, this is just going to be filler. This feels like more pitiful out of Marvel than anything else. This doesn't feel like this was an earned storyline. This just feels like enough people complained about it, and now that she's killed off, there's really not as much hype around it beforehand, but we still have to do it because there's still going to be, some harsh feelings towards us because we didn't make a solo Black Widow movie. I'm going to give Black Widow 2 stars. And one last little note about this movie is it's the Marvel humor works for a lot of people. It certainly does for myself. I like a lot of what the Marvel universe does with its jokes. However, there are some emotional scenes in this movie that do lend itself to be taken less seriously because they have to throw a joke in there. And I do think there are some really good scenes with emotion with the diner scene that they have all together, the family. But there's a lot of scenes in this movie where it's just kind of like, oh, they almost had it. That's a big problem that Marvel has right now. But obviously, if you like the humor that Marvel does, you're going to enjoy it. But that's just something I need to point out there. Anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching. I'll talk to y'all next time.